Welcome, everybody, to episode 1 of Big Data, Big Issues. I'm your host, Sheldon Krieger, and you can find out more about me looking at my LinkedIn profile, which is in the description of this conversation. Today is a very special episode, not only because it's the first episode, but because I want to lay a theoretical foundation that explains my personal beliefs and attitudes about big data, surveillance, and the role that big data and surveillance ought to play in society in the future. And the way I'm going to do this is actually by presenting an objective review of some scholarly work that I've reviewed on this topic, and then briefly at the end give a personal summary of how this has influenced my beliefs on the topic and the path that I see moving forward into the future. So we will begin again with an objective review of some very controversial, undoubtedly, information coming from a few different sources. And then at the end, I will summarize how this has impacted my personal beliefs. So the first area that we're going to look at is called the vulnerable world hypothesis, which is actually a paper that's under work by a philosopher and ethicist named Nick Bostrom at Oxford. And this hypothesis is highly relevant to the issues of big data and surveillance because Bostrom believes that surveillance is one of the key technologies that will be used to protect the future, protect people from emerging threats in the near future. Then we'll move forward to some of these specific threats and the nature of weapons in the future. And finally, we will do a review of an incredible book, very briefly, on the topic of surveillance capitalism, by Shoshana Zuboff, and give a very brief introduction to some of Zuboff's topics and terminology in regard to corporate surveillance and the way that surveillance is today expanding and influencing our society more and more, and look at maybe at some of the negative consequences of that. And then I'm also going to be wrapping things up with my own personal perspective. Imagine in the near future the rise of a sophisticated commercial 3D grade printer, which is used by hundreds of corporations around the world to manufacture components for thousands of products. Engineers use digital blueprints to program these machines, and they can share or even sell the blueprints to other companies. In the wrong hands, the blueprints can be created to create deadly weapons. In a matter of moments, a blueprint for something like a weaponized drone fleet could spread across the globe and unleash unthinkable violence. Recent developments show that these kinds of capabilities will manifest in a number of areas, including manufacturing, cyberspace, robotics, biology, and nanotechnology. Unless we create standards today for handling these emerging threats, there's a very high chance that this kind of power will end up being leveraged to create a massive catastrophe. And this is really the core of the vulnerable world hypothesis. To move on to the vulnerable world hypothesis, imagine an urn that's been filled with balls that are white, black, and gray. And each time there's a new invention brought into existence by scientists or engineers, you can imagine drawing a ball from this urn. The white balls represent technologies which are generally positive for humanity. The black balls represent technologies which result in relatively immediate extinction. And then there's obviously many shades of gray where the technologies have both positive and negative impacts. And Bostrom uses this thought experiment to give a foundation for the vulnerable world hypothesis, arguing that eventually there will be black balls that are drawn from the urn, and absent some kind of social framework to address those problems, the humanity is relatively doomed. So, specifically quoting from Bostrom in his paper, intuitively, the hypothesis is that there is some level of technology at which civilization almost certainly gets destroyed, unless quite extraordinary and historically unprecedented degrees of preventative policing and/or global governance are implemented. More precisely, if technological development continues, then a set of capabilities will at some point be attained that make the devastation of civilization extremely likely, unless civilization sufficiently exits the semi-anarchic default condition. End Bostrom quote. So what are these semi-anarchic default conditions? This is essentially the status quo that Bostrom describes, where we have a limited capacity for preventative policing, we have limited capacity for global governance, and we have a very diverse arrangement of personal motivations, which unfortunately include people who want to harm one another today. And it's important, I think, to frame the conversation around surveillance and big data from looking at the most extreme scenarios that could unfold in the near future, because these kinds of fringe cases are what will be used to set legal precedents at the highest levels of government with the biggest legal cases and so on. Now, moving on from the basics of Bostrom's hypothesis, first of all, it's important to note that there are several different scenarios for that Bostrom outlines for different kinds of black orbs, but we're going to be specifically focused on one category of black orb, which Bostrom describes as the easy nuke. What this means is that there's some development in technology that makes the capacity to manufacture devastating weapons extremely easy and cheap, insofar that, somebody, an individual actor or a small group of people could put one of these weapons together and cause a lot of harm to people. There are, of course, other black orb technologies, but specifically I'm going to be focusing on this category. So if we look at some of the emerging gray orbs that we're already aware of today, there's a book called The Future of Violence from Harvard Law professor Gabriella Blum and Benjamin Witz, who's the senior fellow in governance studies at the Brookings Institution, from 2015. And they outline what they call technologies of empowerment, which give individuals or small groups of people the ability to cause major catastrophes, just as is outlined in Bostrom's vulnerable world hypothesis. And they have 4 categories of these kinds of weapons: bioweapons, cyberspace, robotics, and nanotechnology. To make this a bit more concrete, we can look at the way these gray orbs are emerging today already. I found an article from The Guardian, June 19th, 2019, today being October 23rd, 2019. Very recent development where a student in the UK actually used an at-home 3D printer to build a gun. It's a relatively primitive gun, very pathetic in comparison to commercially manufactured guns today, thankfully. But this set a new precedent in the UK because they were able to convict this case. And when the police discovered the weapon, the investigators viewed the internet browsing history of the suspect, and they were able to learn that the suspect had viewed instructional videos online to manufacture the weapon. And the problem is that these kinds of weapons will expand rapidly in the near future. The second problem here is that today's precedent is to rely on corporate enforcement. It's really one of the few lines of defense that we have against the spread of this kind of technology is for social media platforms and telecommunications companies to have internal policies to place regulations on what kind of information consumers can spread to one another on their social networks. We've seen recently Facebook has made attempts to crack down on hate speech on their platform. Any posts that promote violence against other people, or if there's a known hate group that's planning events on Facebook, they ban them. However, I was watching Zuckerberg's testimony today to the U.S. Congress, and he was saying that this technology, despite them investing billions of dollars here and a lot of engineering efforts, there's still a lot of imperfections. And in fact, one of the congresswomen was able to pull up a post that was active within the last few days of a hate group that was, hosting an event to go intimidate people outside of a mosque somewhere in the United States. So the other problem is, even if the technologies are imperfect, I think those will continue to improve. However, the problem is that the responsibility really should not be falling to Facebook and other social media platforms, telecommunications companies to enforce these kinds of policies, because their incentive is to generate revenue. It's not to protect people. And actually, according to a telegraph.co.uk article that I found a few weeks just after the arrest I mentioned in the UK, this is from July 12th, 2019, Facebook's made a statement that they're actually going to continue to allow some of their users to spread and promote blueprints for 3D printed firearms. And this obviously is a big problem because it allows people who aren't necessarily supposed to have guns to be able to manufacture their own, and they have a special term for this called ghost guns. So in addition to the problem of having a lack of standards for what would be permitted, and the problem of incentives for these kinds of corporations, these are the things that block the effectiveness of corporate policy for addressing these kinds of risks. We also have a very detailed analysis coming from a masterpiece of a book from Shoshana Zuboff, also published this year, called Surveillance Capitalism. And in this book, Zuboff outlines a lot of the incentives that companies today that are collecting consumer behavior that they currently have and that they're expanding upon, and how they use this information to manipulate consumers. Referencing several public lectures, presentations, and articles from tech industry leaders, and after a decade of going around and interviewing top data scientists, CTOs, and tech company executives, Zuboff published this book. It's quite extensive. I think it's over 700 pages long. It's a very good read. But Zuboff developed this narrative in which Silicon Valley businesses are racing for a complete system of surveillance and analysis. Through a rapidly expanding network of sensors, companies collect behavioral data and make predictions about future behavior. This data is currently used primarily to target advertisements to consumers who are more likely to buy a specific product based on the mathematical analysis of their previous behaviors. And this is a process that Zuboff calls the prediction imperative, and it's paired with the extraction imperative, in which there's an endless incentive for companies to collect more and more behavioral data on their consumers so that they can generate more and more revenue. And this is tied very closely to the unbounded nature of capitalism itself. So we're familiar with these kinds of systems in our everyday lives already. When we visit specific web pages, for example, later I would receive advertisements on my phone or even on my TV about maybe some products I was looking at or topics I was reading about. But Zuboff is arguing that things are rapidly moving in a broader direction, and that it's not only about targeted advertising, but about a much broader drive towards manipulation of individual behavior that Zuboff calls instrumentarianism. One controversial example of one of the key pieces of terminology from Zuboff is economies of action. And this is where the tech companies, they collect behavioral data and then they use this to create a much more very sophisticated personalized profiles, and then they have specific manipulation techniques to get people to act in a certain manner or to buy a certain product and so on. So there's some really specific terminology that I'm not necessarily going to dive into right now, but this is all very much expanded upon by Zuboff in this book. And to give some examples of the expansion beyond advertising, one controversial example of behavioral manipulation was detailed in a 2012 article from Nature, a very prestigious academic journal, where Facebook engineers had manipulated 61 million individual news feeds in the run-up to the 2010 congressional election. So this is almost 10 years ago now. They found that giving users a way to easily share the fact that they voted and prompting them with photos of their friends who had also voted had a significant impact on voter turnout for the people who received that kind of nudging. And there are many more examples of these kinds of studies in what is now a very explosive and expanding domain of sociology. Some titles of papers that I found are Social Network Targeting to Maximize Population Behavior Change, a Cluster Randomized Control Trial. Another example, Inferring Population Preferences via Mixtures of Spatial Voting Models. And another example being Active Fairness in Algorithmic Decision Making. So there's very much an active branch of research in this area, and we're seeing more and more kinds of influence in our everyday lives, and this is only going to expand, is Zuboff's argument. And another important thing is that we become conditioned to this kind of manipulation. It may seem that this is kind of far-fetched to think that technology companies can have a radical influence over our day-to-day behavior. However, if you take a moment to think about how things have changed over the last 15 years, have you ever chosen a restaurant based on Yelp reviews? Have you ever found another professional to work with, or a doctor, for example, using a Google search? Or have you ever met somebody on a dating app, or maybe you have friends who have gotten married to somebody that they've met on a dating app? These are all very specific instances of personalized profiling being leveraged to push you in a very specific direction. And although today the intent may not be nefarious, I think that Zuboff, in the book, makes a pretty strong case that the kinds of manipulation that these companies want to have is sort of ever expanding and will eventually become problematic if it's not already. So this leads to an inevitable problem, which is the convergence of these two problem areas, this huge growth in behavioral data and instrumentarianism and the development of widespread surveillance, corporate surveillance systems. And then we have emerging threats on the other hand, with the rise of technologies of mass empowerment. And what we'll see is a convergence of traditional cybersecurity and homeland security operations with behavioral data in order to confront these threats. And it's really impossible to talk about this kind of convergence without mentioning FISA 702, because this is where a lot of the legal authority on the federal level comes from in terms of corporations needing to work in congruence with Homeland Security and other Department of Defense agencies in order to allow them to execute effectively on defensive operations. So under the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act, or FISA, Section 702, government agencies are allowed to surveil any non-U.S. citizens outside of the country. Spying on adversaries is standard procedure in countries around the world, and the U.S. has maintained its capability for many reasons, and this is largely very uncontroversial. In contrast, surveillance targeting U.S. citizens is extremely controversial because we have Fourth Amendment protections under the U.S. Constitution. This is a unique double standard that creates a lot of logistical complications that, frankly, in other countries in the world are completely unthinkable. Spy agencies work with telecommunications companies to organize and fund special directives to facilitate these kinds of missions, which are supervised by a special foreign intelligence surveillance court. And quoting from Jim Dempsey, who is the executive director at the Berkeley Center for Law and Technology, while 702 is targeted and is used to collect only a tiny percentage of the world's communications, it still does involve massive scale. About 100,000 persons are targeted per year, and this yields a lot of information. In 2011, when the number of selectors was smaller than it is today, the government acquired 250 million internet communications in addition to telephone communications. And much of this information relates to persons other than the targets. The Washington Post conservatively estimated that for each targeted person, the communications of at least 9 other people are being collected. By definition, when the government is collecting the communications of a target, it is collecting the communications of those on the other end of the communications. Even when the government is targeting only non-citizens abroad, it is certain to collect communications to and from citizens and persons in this country, persons not suspected of any wrongdoing and not suspected of communicating anything of intelligence value. Searching the 702 repository means that the government is able to retrieve communications of a U.S. person without a court order, communications that the government could not have targeted without a court order in the first place. End the Dempsey quote. Furthermore, I might add, if a domestic target is identified coincidentally while conducting foreign surveillance, this actually does justify a warrant to target that individual in future operations. So if the FBI is performing an operation of surveillance on a foreign target and that person is communicating with a U.S. citizen inside the United States, if they incidentally find that out by monitoring the communications of the foreign person, the otherwise unimplicated U.S. citizen is now completely implicated, and they can be target of warrants and continued investigation. So due to the complexity and sensitive nature of surveillance, while conducting foreign surveillance, there's just a lot of issues that remain unresolved, and there's continuously, it seems every time this FISA legislation comes up, there's amendments being proposed, even as recently as last time I looked, which was June 2019. So this is very much like a hot legal battleground, is setting the legal precedents for how this kind of intelligence can be gathered and the kinds of targets and so on. However, cooperation between government agencies and private corporations is more than that. It's actually a fundamental shift in defensive power from the public sector to the private sector. Surveillance aside, defensive capabilities are, so if we look at, what I'm saying here is that with surveillance, working with private corporations, the only way that the FBI or any of these other defensive agencies can get information about their targets is if the corporate databases already exist, having personal information on the targets. So they can then order a warrant to get that information. And this represents a major shift in the power to the corporate entities. And in addition to that, as if I haven't gone on not long enough about this, oftentimes the defensive capabilities of physical goods, so if we just forget about telecommunications for a minute and we talk about physical products, the defense mechanisms actually need to be built into those products by the manufacturer. There's nothing that the government can do after the fact. For example, anti-counterfeit technology in high-end laser printers isn't something that the FBI could later attach to the devices. It's something that has to be built into the printer by the manufacturer to, for example, prevent people from printing counterfeit currency. But of course, this applies to my 3D printer scenario that I outlined at the beginning, where if there is the capability for these kinds of devices in the future to create dangerous weapons, there has to be some kind of coordination and restrictions placed on those devices before they're shipped out to the public, because then it would be too late. The government, even if they wanted to, may not be able to react effectively once the capability has been deployed. So this raises a number of significant questions. First, what justifies this disparity in authority between government agencies who are seeking to protect us and the private corporations who are seeking to exploit us? Second, given the frequency and scale of corporate database compromises, is it wise that we trust them with securing this kind of sensitive data rather than allowing the government to handle it, where there's actually hopefully some additional safeguards against the data, and there's just a lot more legal oversight in terms of how that data can be used than it would be if it continues to remain in the corporate space. Third, with more communications happening within corporate platforms, such as within Facebook groups or WhatsApp conversations or Facebook Messenger conversations, can we really continue to allow these companies to set their own policies over the standards happening within their platforms? And fourth, can the intelligence community keep up with the growing variety of communications platforms and potentially dangerous physical technologies using these ad hoc directives that are kind of implemented one by one at the federal level in a very, my impression is a relatively inefficient mechanism. So these are all very urgent questions that as big data practitioners or executives or legal teams, whoever you happen to be, I think these are questions that we all need to ponder very deeply. So returning to Bostrom, he does outline a number of potential solutions from a philosophical perspective. So it's important to know that Bostrom isn't necessarily advocating any one of these, at least not initially. He's just simply laying out the theoretical possibilities, regardless of how workable they are or whether they're right or wrong. So the first one would be restricting technological development itself. The second is ensuring that there does not exist a large population of actors representing a wide and recognizably human distribution of motives. So basically, try and make sure that nobody ever wants to kill each other. Nobody ever has that motivation. That's another solution. Third potential solution is establishing an extremely effective preventative policing mechanism. And the fourth potential solution from Bostrom is establishing an effective global governance mechanism. Bostrom, of course, it's very obvious that the first two solutions are just completely unworkable because humans will always have a diversity of motives, and restraining technological development is also unworkable, mostly for not only for economic reasons, but it's very obvious why that's not possible. And so what Bostrom really then focuses on is the potential to establish preventative policing combined with a global governance system. And the cornerstone technology, of course, of this kind of thing is surveillance itself, and combined with big data technology and artificial intelligence and predictive analytics and all this kind of stuff that we're very familiar with as practitioners. With sufficient surveillance, we could prevent dangerous information from spreading, restrict access to requisite materials, instruments, and infrastructure, deter potential evildoers by increasing the chance of their getting caught beforehand, be more cautious, and do more risk assessment work in general. And we could establish some kind of surveillance and enforcement mechanism that would make it possible to interdict attempts to carry out a destructive act. So these are, again, things that Bostrom's laying out. I'm not advocating any of these quite yet, but I do want to present Bostrom's argument in full for everyone to consider. So if we do, I think now is actually the time to start delving away from just objectively sharing the information from these authors and encouraging you to think to what I think are potential solutions in this area, and bringing my own personal opinion into this. And of course, none of this is representative of my employer's past, present, or future, nor is it does it represent any legal expertise, because I'm not a lawyer. This is all my personal opinion. So first of all, we have to expand government capabilities to have stronger coordination with private corporations. First, manufacturers of any potential gray and black orb technologies need to be regulated to limit the capabilities of their technologies within a safe manner. Second, technologies with potential for abuse via modification or hacking of those devices, they need to be, if that possibility exists, they need to be tracked so that if there is an exploit, they can be disabled and potentially recalled. Third, professionals who work with gray or black orb technologies and professionally need to agree to ongoing surveillance to prevent them from abusing the technology in a nefarious way and building these kinds of weapons that we've been talking about. And last, if a widely available technology does become suddenly threatening, there needs to be a widespread surveillance system so that we can respond immediately and contain that situation. And so that last statement is probably the most controversial, and I will move forward with why I believe that there is justification for having a more widespread surveillance system to anticipate and respond to these kinds of threats that will inevitably arise. So if we continue to ignore this problem, let's say that we take a more hardline privacy stance, like what I honestly used to hold personally, which is that it's just ethically wrong to conduct surveillance and to impose on people's privacy, and we just reject the idea of collecting data about everybody because of some ethical concerns, as legitimate as those might be, and there are many of them. We have to take into consideration the nature of these threats and what would happen if one of these scenarios unfolded. So, for example, if there were 3D printers across the world, and then there was suddenly some kind of blueprint released to manufacture a very dangerous weapon, and that resulted in a huge catastrophe. Or another scenario I could think of is consumers buying up drones and modifying them to have weapons attached to them, and purchasing large quantities of the drones and weaponizing them, maybe working in conspiracy with other people, and then using that to launch some kind of massive attack against political opponents or against the state or whatever it happens to be. There's all kinds of scenarios that we can go over here, but the problem is, if one of these things does happen, the consequence of that is not only the damage of the catastrophe itself from an ethical perspective in terms of lives lost and so on, but also from a legal perspective, which is there will be an immediate lockdown where the Constitution is thrown into a state of exception, which is historically something that has happened, particularly after 9/11. And so given, for example, if we look at the Patriot Act, which was passed after the terrorist attacks in September 11th, 2001, the government was forced to declare a state of emergency, and then they were able to justify arresting people and putting them in camps like Guantanamo, and then without having normal due process or really following international law. And in fact, there's been quite a bit of scholarly work on this problem, particularly a 2005 book from George Agamben called The State of Exception. And in this book, he argues that the abrupt suspension of the law in the face of a crisis often comes at the price of human rights violations, like I mentioned, these enemy combatants in Guantanamo Bay. But furthermore, this condition has a tendency to become a prolonged state of being, and often there's not a return to normalcy. So I believe that is the ultimate kind of justification for implementing a preventative system in the first place. If we take into consideration, if we have the time, while we do now, to take into consideration all of the ethical problems of a widespread surveillance system and the complications of government regulation on potentially dangerous technologies and preventing the spread of those technologies, we will have a system which is more restrained than if we allow an attack to unfold and then reflexively suspend the law and lay down some kind of very widespread totalitarian type of system. And so I believe that the concern for privacy, for me personally, the conclusion I came to was that because of my concern for privacy, I'm actually now advocating for this kind of preventative policing system, because I think that it's inevitable that this kind of scenario will unfold if we don't have it. And the end product that we have, if something like that does happen, is just going to be a lot more damaging to privacy in the long term. So that really wraps up episode 1, Big Data, Big Issues. This is a lot of information, a lot of really heavy problems, but I wanted to portray my passion for this topic, as well as give a introduction to the foundation of my beliefs surrounding big data and surveillance. In later episodes, we'll be exploring in more detail particular pieces of legislation. For example, episode 2 is about the Washington Privacy Act of 2019, and we'll be looking at current events, historical examples, as well as the more theoretical, fundamental problems that I think that we need to face as a community. So with that, I'm Sheldon Kreger. Again, thank you for joining, and I hope that you tune in next time.
The best way to support this podcast is to like and leave comments, as well as share the episode with your friends and colleagues. You can find detailed notes, reading suggestions, and a complete episode list at bigdatabigissues.com.